Welcome to Oak City Church, a family of learners, lovers, and givers sent. For more information, visit us online at oakcitychurch.com. Let us know if we can help you in any way. Thank you for listening.
All right, please stand for the word of the Lord. This is Mark 15, 16 through 32. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him.
And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. They crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning. Good morning. So, like Kelly mentioned, I am Weston, for those of you who don't know me. I am not the normal preacher. I'm just a guy who gets invited to do the sermon sometimes so that Jeff can go on vacation. In which today we're continuing our series in Mark, and we're going to be concentrating on the crucifixion, closure, and fairness. So, like I said, I'm not a preacher. My day job is a data scientist, which for those of you who don't really know what that is, most people don't. It means I take numbers and make sense of them. Another way to describe it is that I am really good at quantifying uncertainty. So if there's uncertainty, I can tell you how much uncertainty and probabilistically what that means. So you can go ahead and say nerd, it will only empower me more. But so by my training, I'm used to feeling comfortable with uncertainty. But I know a lot of people are not like that and don't like the feeling of the unknown. In the past, I've led a theology class with Ken, and which the tagline of the class is to bring doubt to those with certainty and certainty to those with doubt. So I'll be the first to say that there is some healthy amount of both certainty and uncertainty, and you know that's a healthy thing. But I'll also be the first to admit that I hate not knowing what's to come. It's not that I want everything to feel like it's deterministic or predictable. It's that I long for that feeling of safety, or maybe that I have some sense of being in control. So, my man, there's this tension, this unresolved tension just in life of that is constantly unresolved of, hey, I just want everything to be okay. And we all experience this, and everybody handles this tension differently. Some people ignore the tension and hope it goes away. Some people, like me, try to predict it. Some people turn to prayer and ask, what can I do to help? Some people feel like uncertainty is a thrill. I mean, that's probably why roller coasters are a thing, because there's only a really small chance that you're going to die, right? It's like bounded uncertainty. The ironic part about this, and like I said, uncertainty itself is not bad, but this same desire of feeling uncertainty is why we watch sports live, right? We want to experience the unpredictability alongside others, right? For anybody that stayed up really late to watch the World Cup last night, like that was, if you saw the score in the morning, it's not the same, right? In fact, I read that only 8 to 12% of sports fans will watch sports on replay, and that's it. But let's take this in the context of what sports are. The outcomes of sports are bounded, both in time and consequence. So you've got 2 hours, and really the worst thing that could happen to you, ultimately, is that your mood is ruined. Like, you're just like in a bad mood. But you can always choose to stop watching, or if Bill Belichick is your coach, you don't even have to watch to know the outcome, right? So don't worry, I'm safe because my UNC wife is watching this from afar. Love you guys. Shout out to you. And I mean, the same is true with NC State basketball. We know what happens, except for that one march, which is great. But most life decisions are not sports, and they don't have a bound in the certainty or the consequence. There's no replay option, and so we want to know what will happen, right? All right, so question. How many in here, if you could know the date of your death, would want to know it? Raise your hand. A few people? Oh, I thought it was going to be more than that. Okay. We'll do it again. Phil, if you want to know the date of your death, raise your hand. Okay, wow. Okay, I'm surprised. Yeah, so I read in an article about how humans are the only living thing that worries about the future, with the theory that we're the only living thing that understands the relationship between time, self, emotion, and death. Pretty cool, right? I'll read this. This is not just a curiosity, but a craving, a need to control of the unknown. A deer does not fear winter. A bird does not build a nest in anticipation of tomorrow. A squirrel gathering acorns appears unconcerned about the future. Instead, these actions are driven by instinct rather than a conscious life plan. However, humans have concerns about the future because they know the concept of time and the correlation of their existence in it. So this is where I'm going to set the stage today. Because you probably are wondering, how does this relate to the scripture they read? How does this relate to the crucifixion? I'm going to ask you a question, and it's not going to make sense, but I want you to keep it in your back pocket because we're going to go through until it makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to ask this question. Where does your reflexive uncertainty reside? Is it on Good Friday, during the crucifixion, or after Easter Sunday? All right, so again, remember that we're going through Mark 2, and then 2 weeks ago, the last time we met, Jeff was walking us through the story about, was walking us through the trial in which Pontius Pilate sentenced him to the cross. But for the next little, so now we're a little bit further in the story, and I want us to live in that moment, and so what I'm going to ask you to do is to live in that moment of the day of the crucifixion, before Sunday has arrived, so that Friday, right, the Good Friday. And I want us to sit in that day and think about the uncertainty that was felt. And I want to relate it out to us in 2 fundamental feelings that are captured in our life experience that we're going to walk through today, and that's the feelings of closure and fairness. Okay, so that's where we're going. We're going to go through the story. We're going to talk about closure, then we're going to talk about fairness. So so that hopefully that'll help you follow along where we're going, because it's going to get a little bit convoluted. I'll try to keep us on track. So let's dive back into Scripture. And so we're in Mark 15, 16 through 32, and this is the part of this part of the Scripture is divided into 2 scenes: the mocking part, and then the crucifixion itself. Now, in both of these scenes, there are 3 types of people that are here. There's the Roman authority, there's the Jewish believers, and then there's the Jewish non-believers. So the Jewish believers of Jesus and the Jewish non-believers, the Jews. And so the Roman soldiers are the authority, while the Jews watched everything unfold. All right, so in the mocking, the first scene, we see Jesus was degraded and belittled by the Roman soldiers as the Jewish crowd looked on. They gave him a purple robe and a crown of thorns, and they mocked him. And y'all have probably heard, I think you understand intuitively what this means. They were doing this to symbolically, emotionally, and physically strip away the dignity and the regality that his followers believed him to have, right? So crown of thorns, purple robe, because kings would wear purple. And the point of this was to absolutely mock and debase this man, who we saw in the previous scene was sentenced to death without formal Roman charges. So keep that in mind, because the Roman soldiers know what they're doing to a man who under Roman law didn't do anything wrong, right? Because it was the Jewish leaders that said, we want him sentenced. And we'll talk about this in a second, that a lot of Roman justice is done in order to maintain social order. All right, so if we hop out of Mark and we turn over to Luke, there's one additional piece of the story that gives us one sentence that almost feels impossible to process in this moment, right? Jesus said, and this is as they were doing all of these things to him with the robe and the crowning thorn, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." And they divided his clothes up by casting lots. One of the things I had trouble with while preparing for this sermon was trying to reconcile the Greek word for forgiveness with our modern sensibilities. So when you read forgiveness, it doesn't mean the emotional reconciliation as we interpret it today. In Greek, the word here is called aphiemi. I'm not a Greek scholar by any means. And it has the sense of letting go. So how would Jesus' idea of forgiveness be taken here? For both Romans and Jews, this statement would have been perceived as ridiculous. For Romans, revenge was often seen as necessary in order to maintain dignity. You don't simply let someone go. You don't let something go. If someone insults you, you best respond equally or more. In their honor-based culture, forgiveness was seen as a weakness. And so that's from the Roman perspective, okay? Remember, there's also Jews in this. For the Jews at the time, forgiveness between people was typically conditional on repentance and restitution. And we'll talk about this later, but any justice handed out was considered a righteous act of God. And because Jesus is asking intercession for God to other people, it probably riles them up even more because, again, like in order for that forgiveness to happen, that person needs to communicate directly with Jesus. With God. So to both of these people, Jesus' words were ludicrous. No one had a category for it. It would be like trying to explain what a hashtag is to somebody who lived, 200 years ago. It's completely foreign. Like it just doesn't make sense. And they all laughed at how ridiculous that comment sounded. It's kind of like, have you ever been in a room in which the entire room was against you, and you thought it was just because they didn't understand what you were trying to say? Like that's what the first part of the scene is setting up, right? So that's the mock scene. The next part of the scene was the crucifixion itself. And I'm just now starting to appreciate just how awful the crucifixion was. This week during my prep, I actually found that our English word excruciating comes from the Roman word that means out of the cross. So you've got ex, out of, and crux, the cross. It was that bad. Like when we think of excruciating, we mean like the worst of the worst painful, right? It was so bad that Romans themselves were not allowed to be crucified unless there was a direct order from Caesar himself. The Roman statesman Cicero said, "It is a crime to bind a Roman citizen, to scourge him is an act of wickedness, to execute him is almost murder. What shall I say of crucifying him? An act so abominable, it is impossible to find any word adequately to express." The Roman historian Tacitus described the crucifixion as a torture fit only for slaves. In addition to the physical torture, we also have to understand that only one of the disciples was reported to be there. There were several women followers, but all of the men except for John were not at his side during the cross. So let's take a step back and think about this whole scene, right? We're in the scene. We're witnessing this scene on Friday as a follower of Jesus. Your hope for the future lay within this man. He was mocked humiliated, tortured, and many of the people that he dearly loved had abandoned him in fear for their own lives. The earth shook and the sky turned dark. The revenge of the Jewish leaders and the crowds was now satisfied, and Jesus was dead. And so it's this feeling that we sit in. It's why we end our Tenebrae service on Good Friday, the Good Friday before Easter Sunday, on such a low note. And this is the story of the crucifixion. The unresolved tension of sitting here on Friday. All right, so I'm going to change it for a second. Is anyone here a Marvel fan? Marvel movie fan? Yes? Okay, good. So this will probably land. So I probably mentioned them way too much, again, because I'm a nerd. I love these things. And in 2008, the movie Avengers Infinity War was released. Now, for people who aren't huge Marvel nerds, I need to give you a little bit of background here. So the way that Marvel had done this was revolutionary in the way that they had set up for the past 10 years. They had individual independent films where you have like Thor and his adventure, and Captain America and his adventure, and Iron Man and his adventure. And all of them this story started to interweave with each other slowly but surely. So in order to understand Infinity War, you really had to watch all 15 of these movies. Like, it was a long path, and we were like, we being the fans were like, yes, it's here, it's finally here, we've been waiting, I can't wait to see. And so there's, throughout the overarching arc of this story, there was a villain called Thanos. And he had been, and this is where it gets really super nerdy, so just bear with me. But he had been collecting these cosmic gems that he was going to use to finish his own sense of justice in the world. And so I'm in the theater, and I'm watching Infinity War. And it's the part of the movie where everything is at its worst. And you're bracing yourself because you just know, like, okay, but that's okay. Like, something good's going to happen. Something's going to happen. And then Thor, the strongest Avenger, comes in, and he's got his new weapon that he's going to save the day, right? And here it comes. Oh, this is the ending I've been waiting for. But then Thor missed. And Thanos, the big bad guy, snapped his fingers, and within that, 50% of the universe was defeated right then and there. And then we watched the people fade away slowly but surely. They turn into dust, and it's kind of weird. And you're left sitting there, huh? And then the final scene. I'm looking at my watch, like, wait, hold on. It's getting pretty close to the end here. What's going to happen? And then the final scene ends like this. And you've got Thanos smiling, and it fades to black. So, guys, I've been waiting for this movie for 10 years. Like, this was it, right? And Thanos was the obvious symbolism of death, and death won. And so how many people walked away from that movie pleased with the outcome? And so as the credits roll, and you think about how the movie played out, you have an unsettling realization. Because the way that, if you think about how the movie was directed, and it all played out, maybe Thanos was actually the protagonist all along. And it hits you. Was he actually right? Did he need to destroy 50% of the universe in order to save the universe? Was I rooting for the wrong team all along? If not, like, how did this happen? And so you see the parallel here, right? At Friday, at the cross. If you're a follower, what do you think you're asking yourself? Was Jesus not the protagonist? Were the Romans and Jews actually right? If he was one with God, then why didn't he do something to stop it? And so I want us to reflect that on Friday, and then I want to ask this question. When bad things happen, does that reflexively shake your certainty about the world? And does it make you ask, is what I believe true? Does it matter? What is going to happen? And again, is everything going to be okay? So our home group met a few months ago, and we had a discussion about how we have, or maybe this was a few weeks ago, but we had a discussion about how we have so much unresolved tension right now with all the bad things in the world as it is. Iran, droughts, murders, AI, Charlie Kirk, Trump, Graham Plattner, the stock market, right? And as we talked through our emotions, we came to the conclusion that we're all just asking the same question. Please tell me that everything is going to be okay. So that's the story. So now let's talk about closure for a second, right? Story, closure, fairness. So in psychology, there's a concept called Tracy, keep me honest here, the Zeigarnik effect. Is that right? Zeigarnik? Okay. Which is something that everyone experiences, and it's a psychological phenomenon that states that people remember incomplete tasks or unfinished stories better than the complete ones. It explains why cliffhangers are so captivating and why closure is so important to us. And I'm just going to read this from the website that I got this from. It says that when a narrative is interrupted, your brain begins to crave resolution like an itch that needs scratching. This sense of incompleteness gnaws at our attention, driving us to seek closure. A cliffhanger in unresolved news stories taps directly into this need for resolution, ensuring that the unresolved story stays top of mind. It's why my home group feels uneasy, and it's why we all remember the last scene of the movie Inception, right? We all remember that. Did the top stop spinning in the last scene? Y'all remember? Do any of you feel like you were left shorthanded because there was no closure, because you weren't told by the story creator what the top was going to do? So generative AI is like ChatGPT and Claude actually are designed with this in mind. The reality is that these products are just predicting the next word. So theoretically, they could go on forever. But the product designers behind it have designed it not only to provide an end to the response as a normal person would, but to provide closure with emotional certainty for you. That's why even when it's wrong, it'll sound confident because it is designed to provide that emotional closure for you. There's a ton of psychological research that goes into compensating for our need for closure from the words that we read or the words that we hear. Okay, so I know we've been pretty serious so far. I want to come back up for a second because this is a fun story, and this is one of my all-time favorite stories. And it was told to me originally by Alan Wilser, and then I got confirmation on this from Kevin Carrata a couple of weeks ago, and I got their permission to say it. So bear with me for a minute, but I love this because I wish I was there. So let's preface this with what I just said. And let's also preface it with that y'all know that Kevin Carrata loves to talk, right? Not only that, but he's got a voice for the radio. Like, it's booming. Like, I love his voice. So anyway, so as the story goes, Kevin is on a missions trip down in Nicaragua. And they are driving between towns in one of those 15-people passenger vans, and it's packed with people, right? And Kevin is doing his sheen, sharing his love for people through his capacity to talk, right? And apparently this had been going on for a while. And Macy Wiltzer was also one of those people in the van who was 3 years old at the time. And if y'all don't know Macy, she is one of the most amazingly modest and just amazing little girls that you'll ever meet. She's awesome. She's 13 now? 13 now. So 10 years ago. And as the story goes, Kevin keeps talking, and then there's keeps doing his thing, and then finally there's a break in the action. And so 3-year-old Macy turns to Kevin and says, "Do you stop talking?" To which the whole band busts out laughing. I wasn't there, but do you see this? Do you see what was happening? Do you see it? She gets it. She needs to know. It's so natural that even a 3-year-old understands that. Please let me know that everything's going to go back to a state that I'm satisfied with. According to psychological research, when we don't have closure, our brains are constantly simulating future possibilities. but most often the negative scenarios. So little Macy's brain, if I could reach into 3-year-old Macy's brain, I would imagine it was something like, he's never going to stop talking, and I may never be able to rest again. I desperately need to know when this will end. So our desire for closure is wanting certainty in the sense that we can act with the knowledge about the future. Maybe Macy just wanted to go to sleep, but she knew that she couldn't if this was going to happen. But uncertainty requires more cognitive load while actively considering all possibilities, and this cognitive overload produces anxiety. And so now let's fast forward. Let's go hop back into the story of the crucifixion and fast forward a little bit. And Luke gives a glimpse of what it could have been like to exist during that weekend because, as a follower of Jesus. So if you remember this is after the stone is rolled away from the empty tomb. Two of Jesus' followers are on a walk down the road where Jesus joins them. They don't know it's Jesus yet. And he asks them about what's going on. And so this is the reply. They say, about Jesus of Nazareth, he was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priest and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one that was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. So this is what they had been living with. They had been thinking about it for the past 2 days with no closure. And you can read into this that this is the third day. Like they knew what Jesus had taught them, that something was going to happen. But as far as they could see, nothing had happened. So with their known information, they had resolved to a couple of things. If you go back to the previous slide real quick, that number one, he was a prophet. And two, that the Romans and Jewish authorities attained their sense of justice. Their sense of justice. No clean ending and no sense that the story had been resolved the way that they were expected. They were anxious, and they don't have closure. But we still haven't really addressed the issue underneath that feeling. How do we know that what happened to Jesus was a bad thing in the first place? Is it because the story is told as Jesus as the protagonist? Right? Trying to contrast that Thanos thing, right? Or are these followers experiencing this because there was a sense of helplessness in the face of what they thought was supreme injustice? All right, so now let's talk about the fairness aspect of this. So what you have to understand about in this scene is just like forgiveness, our modern sense of fairness was formulated. It was completely different. It was actually what our modern sensibility of fairness is as a result of the Christian influence over hundreds of years after this has all taken place. So for Romans, again, revenge was fairness. You used it to maintain dignity. In an honor-based culture, fairness was doled out as a logical way to maintain social order and was often given based on your social rank. In Judaism, forgiveness between people was conditioned on repentance and restitution. We already talked about that, but fairness itself was not a civic right. It was a theological law prescribed by God to be followed. So you don't do it because it's right, you do it because God says so. In other words, God's justice was given to those who deserved it, and that was what was considered fair. So as Jeff said a couple of weeks ago, for Jesus to ask forgiveness from the cross was not just surprising when they heard this, it disrupted the categories everyone was using to make sense of justice. And just like we talked about it, it was laughable. So dying for others and asking for forgiveness while they're actively killing you is not just countercultural, it's counterintuitive to everyone who's there. There's no obvious moral basis to ground that kind of response. And in the grander scheme of what's going on in this scene, it sets up as it's really a competition about the appropriate philosophy of what is fair. Today we know of three main flavors that at least exist in Western society that we view as fair: justice, mercy, and grace. Now, a few weeks ago, Mama Pat was doing the children's ministry. I was doing the children's ministry with Mama Pat, and we were talking about the parable of the workers' wages, where the same people who got paid, it was like $200 at the beginning of the day, were the same people that got paid at the end of the day. And we talked about the fairness of that. But Mama Pat gave a great analogy of getting pulled over the police for speeding. And so I want to reemphasize how these are three different ideals of fairness, okay? So justice. Justice would be getting the ticket. So let's say you're speeding and a cop pulls you over. Justice would be that you get the ticket that you deserve. You were speeding, okay? The law was clear and the consequence fits what's happened. So that's justice. You get the consequence you deserve. Mercy. Mercy would be the police officer choosing not to give you a ticket in spite of the fact that you had broken the law. You still broke the law, but the punishment you deserved was withheld due to the mercy of the police officer. So you don't get the consequence that you do deserve. Grace. Grace would be the officer not only letting you go, but then handing you extra tickets to a concert that he happened to have, just by running into you. It is receiving goodness that you did not deserve. So grace is getting something you don't deserve. And this distinction matters because when we talk about fairness, most of us reflexively think about justice. This is why when the next Avengers movie came out, you'll be happy to know, and this is like 8 years old, so we're past spoiler points, guys. They killed Thanos, and they resurrected 50% of the universe, and it was awesome. It was like the best movie ever. But ultimately, what that did for me is that something evil happens, and I wanted the guilty party to be exposed. I wanted the wrong to be made right, and I wanted the story to end with the consequence landing where it belongs, where I felt it belongs. So on Friday, nothing looks resolved, and everything seems unjust. Jesus is dead, the guilty seems untouched, and the people who loved him are left holding the tension of a story that appears to have ended in the wrong direction. So there's the closure and the fairness aspect. Then Saturday comes. And Saturday is weird because nothing's changed. There's no resurrection. There's no explanation. There's silence. This is what we heard from the followers that were walking on the road to Emmaus. But this is the part. From this side of history, past Sunday, 2,000 years past Sunday, we could see something that they couldn't. Grace was already moving underneath the silence. Jesus was in the darkness, defeating death. Do y'all remember, Kyle, gosh, I can't think of his last name. He used to come to our church. Kyle Custer, yes, thank you. I love, one time he gave me the analogy, he was like, yeah. He's like, and so Jesus was down in hell just kicking the crap out of death and beating up Satan during these days. Like, we just didn't get to see it because it's not written as a historical context of what happened. But I love that idea, like, that Jesus just like, boom, boom, defeating death, right? So Jesus was down, this is what was happening on Saturday. On Friday, so let's put this in the greater context. On Friday, everyone is hoping for justice. But God has been planning grace all along. Right? We were hoping for justice, but God's story was grace. And that's precisely what happens on Sunday. Jesus rose. He wasn't just a prophet. He wasn't a blasphemist. He proved that he is who they thought he was. And that's when we understand Friday in the proper context now. We move from feeling that it was a supreme injustice on Friday to understanding the plan for complete grace on Sunday. And I want you to sit in that for a moment. And I want you to ask yourself again that question. Where does my reflexive uncertainty reside? Is it on Friday? Or is it after Sunday? Right? Do we worry about our injustice in our own lives that we overlook God's plan? I think to me, the hardest part about this story is to remember that Jesus forgave the Roman soldiers. They were not the antagonist. In Jesus' narrative of the story, they are not the bad guys. There is no good and bad here in the story. They are just like us, not worthy of grace, but receiving it abundantly. I mean, would the story have been better or provided more emotional closure if Jesus had rose from the dead and enacted revenge on them? Think about that for a second. That's not grace. That's not what he had been preaching. So the only difference between us and the Romans or the non-Jewish believers at the time is that we have put our faith to provide closure in our story. One, accepting that his forgiveness was necessary for my salvation. Two, acknowledging that he defeated death. And with that, everything will be okay. So Jeff mentions Jordan Peterson every now and then, and he's a PhD clinical psychologist who's highly regarded because he's incredibly eloquent and insightful. I personally really enjoy listening to him. But it's often talked about how close he is to being a Christian. Like, he uses a lot of the same language, and so you're like, is he not? But I was watching an interview one time in which Jordan Peterson, he gets really pressed on what he believes is the miracle of Jesus. And he doesn't talk about the resurrection. He talks about how Jesus brings the concept of emotional forgiveness and grace into Western thought. And he said that in itself is a miracle. Again, he's a psychologist, so this is how his brain works. I quantify uncertainty. He thinks about things from a psychological perspective. But while the forgiveness on Friday is amazing, the real miracle happens on Sunday. Friday means nothing without Sunday. The only way that Christ proved that he was capable of forgiving people on God's behalf was by rising on Sunday. Else, there is really a good argument that he was not, in fact, the protagonist, that he was not the good guy. Lord, liar, lunatic, right? I'm sure we've heard that before. And so, with that, it's hard for me to get that closure. Without Sunday, it's hard for me to get closure that everything will be okay. But we're on the good side of Sunday. We sing, the cross is enough for me, right? Just like Kendall said, talked about the theology of songs. Like, it's so great that you brought that up, because think about the theology of that song. We can only sing that with confidence. The cross is enough for me, right? Well, it is, but that's because we understand it as a reflection of Sunday, because we have faith that Sunday happened. The cross is not enough because of his suffering and his forgiveness, but because the crucified Christ is also the risen Christ. All right. So this is the last thing I'm going to say. Jeff says that 90% of sermons are do better, try harder, and it can become very anxious very quickly. And so it causes people to act out of guilt and shame, and I don't want to do that. I do want to leave you with an interesting parable written a few years ago that, as you'll see, doesn't provide closure, and I want you to sit and think about it. It's about 3 to 4 minutes long, and after I read it, I'm not going to pray. I'm just going to lead the stage, and instead, I'd ask you to sit in it for a moment and reflect on what it means. And when I'm done, my hope is that you'll ask yourself, either here or maybe to someone on the ride home, where does my reflexive uncertainty reside? Is it on Friday or after Sunday? All right. So this is called Being the Resurrection, from The Orthodox Heretics, written by Peter Rollins. It's a fictional story, just so we're clear. It's a fictional parable, so we're clear. Late that evening, a group of unknown disciples packed their few belongings and left for a distant shore, for they could not bear to stay another moment in the place where their Messiah had just been crucified. Weighed down with that sorrow, they left that place, never to return. So this is on Saturday. Instead, they traveled a great distance in search of a land that they could call home. After several months of difficult travel, they finally happened upon an isolated area that was ideal for setting up a new community. Here they found fertile ground, clean water, and a nearby forest from which to harvest material needed to build shelters. So they settled there, founding a community far from Jerusalem, a community where they vowed to keep the memory of Christ alive and live in simplicity, love, and forgiveness, just as he had taught them. The members of this community lived in great solitude for over 100 years, spending their days reflecting on the life of Jesus, attempting to remain faithful to his ways. And they did all this despite the overwhelming sorrow in their heart. But their isolation was eventually broken when, early one morning, a small band of missionaries reached the settlement. These missionaries were amazed at the community they found. What was most startling to them was that these people had no knowledge of the resurrection and the ascension of Christ, for they had left Jerusalem before his return from the dead on the third day. Without hesitation, the missionaries gathered all the community members and recounted what had occurred after the imprisonment and bloody crucifixion of their Lord. That evening, there was a great festival in the camp as people celebrated the news of the missionaries. Yet, as the night progressed, one of the missionaries noticed that the leader of the community was absent. This bothered the young man, so he set out to look for his respected elder. Eventually, he found the community's leader crouched in a small hut on the fringe of the village, praying and weeping. "Why are you in such sorrow?" asked the missionary in amazement. "Today is a time for great celebration." "It may be indeed a day for great celebration, but this is also a day of sorrow," replied the elder, remained crouched on the floor. "Since the founding of this community, we have followed the ways taught to us by Christ. We pursued his way faithfully, even though it cost us dearly, and we remained resolute despite the belief that death had defeated him and one day would defeat us also." The elder slowly got to his feet and looked the missionary compassionately in the eyes. The elder said, "Each day we have forsaken our very lives because we judged him wholly worthy of the sacrifice, wholly worthy of our being. But now, following your news, I am concerned that my children and my children's children may follow him, not because of his radical life and supreme sacrifice, but selfishly because his sacrifice will ensure their personal salvation and eternal life." With this, the elder turned and left the hut, making his way to the celebrations, and that could be heard dim in the distance, leaving the missionary crouched on the floor.